My father was dying, and somehow that still was not the worst thing he almost left me with. He had been in the hospital for 4 days when he called me closer to his bed, lowered his voice, and asked me a question no daughter expects to hear from a man who can barely keep his eyes open. He asked how my marriage was. Then he asked if I trusted my husband. The way he looked at me after that made my stomach turn cold, because it did not feel like a sick old man making conversation. It felt like someone trying to get a warning out before time ran out. My name is Denise. I was 38 then, living outside Dallas with my husband, Murillo, and our 2 children. We had been married almost 13 years. My life was not perfect, but it was stable in the way a lot of women's lives look stable from the outside. The house ran. The bills got paid. The kids were healthy. My husband worked. I stayed home. We had routines, family dinners, school pickups, long grocery lists, and the kind of tired marriage that no longer looks romantic, but still feels solid enough to lean on. At least that was what I told myself. My father was still my reference for almost everything, even as an adult. My mother had died years earlier, and because I was an only child, losing my father felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no railing. He had built a small accounting office from nothing. He was disciplined, respected, sharp even in old age, and the kind of man who could say very little and still make people listen. Murillo worked with him. More than that, Murillo had become his right-hand man over the years, the person my father trusted most inside the business. At the time, I thought that meant something good. When I visited my father that last afternoon, the room smelled like antiseptic and stale air conditioning. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not weak exactly, not in spirit, but physically reduced, like the body I had known my whole life was suddenly no longer enough to hold him. I sat beside him and tried to smile. I asked if he wanted water. He shook his head. Then he motioned with 2 fingers for me to come closer. His voice was rough when he said, "Daughter, I should have had this conversation with you a long time ago. I kept putting it off." I leaned in so far my arm brushed the hospital rail. Then he asked, "How's your marriage?" I actually gave a nervous little laugh because the question felt so out of place. "What do you mean?" "It's fine." He kept watching me. I said, "It's good, Dad. I mean, as good as any marriage is. We have ups and downs, but we're fine." He wet his lips slowly. "Are you happy with Murillo?" I remember the exact feeling that climbed into my throat then. Not fear yet. More like irritation mixed with unease. "Why are you asking me that?" He did not answer. He asked something worse. "Do you trust him?" I stared at him. Then he said, "Do you think he's faithful to you?" That was the moment the air changed in the room. I straightened up so fast the chair legs scraped the floor. "Dad, what is this? Do you know something? Are you trying to tell me something?" He held my eyes with this tired, serious look that made my skin prickle. I knew my father. He was not dramatic. He was not paranoid. He did not throw suspicion into the air for no reason. If he had asked that, there was a reason. He opened his mouth. And right then the nurse came in and said visiting hours were over. I almost snapped at her. I told her I just needed another minute. My father lifted one hand weakly and said, "Go, daughter. We'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow. That word lived inside me all the way home like a splinter. By the time I got back to the house, my mind had turned against itself. I replayed his face, his tone, the sequence of the questions. I told myself maybe he was confused. Maybe illness had made him suspicious. Maybe he was just worried about me in a broad, fatherly way. But none of that felt right. My father had not sounded confused. He had sounded delayed, like a man arriving late to a truth he hated. Murillo asked if I had gone to see him. I said yes. He asked how my father was doing. I said, about the same. That was true. I did not tell him about the questions. I did not know what exactly my father had meant. And I was not about to start a fire in my own house over a half-finished conversation from a hospital room. Still, I watched Murillo more closely that night than I had in years. He sat at the table with one ankle over his knee, scrolling through his phone while half listening to our son talk about school. He looked normal, annoyingly normal. He asked whether there was more iced tea. He reminded our daughter to finish her math. He complained about traffic and said someone at the office had mixed up 2 client folders. That was all. Nothing strange, nothing dramatic. Just my husband. But after my father asked those questions, even normal started to feel suspicious. The next morning, before I had even brushed my hair, the hospital called. I knew before they said it. No one from a hospital calls early with good news. There is a certain tone in those calls, a thin, professional softness that makes your body go cold before your mind catches up. They asked me to come in. By the time I got there, I was already shaking. My father had died at 5:15 that morning. For a few seconds, I heard nothing after that. The room blurred. I remember sitting down because my knees felt gone. I remember somebody touching my shoulder. I remember crying in a way that did not even sound like me. I had lost my mother years before, and I had thought I understood grief after that. I did not. Losing my father cracked open something older and deeper. Maybe because with him went the last person in my life who had known me before I belonged to anyone else. He also died before finishing that conversation. That detail should have consumed me right away, but grief is strange. It shoves everything else into the background for a while, even things that should matter. In those first days, I was too wrecked to do anything except survive the funeral, answer calls, sign forms, hug people I barely recognized, and sit at my own kitchen table feeling like the room was missing walls. Murillo handled everything with the office. Because I was my father's only child, everything legally became mine, including the accounting business. But I knew nothing about running it. I had never worked there. I had barely even visited. My father had built that place, and I had always treated it like part of his world, not mine. So when all the paperwork settled, Murillo naturally stepped in and took over daily operations. At the time, that seemed practical. He already worked there. He knew the clients. He knew the staff. He knew how the place functioned. He told me not to worry about it, and that he would keep things steady until I was ready to think clearly. I was grieving so hard I almost felt grateful not to have to make decisions. For a while, I let the days happen to me. I woke up tired, moved around the house like a guest in my own life, took care of the kids, and spent too much time in quiet rooms. Grief had a way of flattening everything. The smell of my father's cologne on an old jacket, a receipt in one of his drawers, a voicemail I had not deleted. Those things could ruin a whole afternoon. Some days I would start folding laundry and end up sitting on the floor with a towel in my hands and no idea how long I had been there. Through all of that, my father's unfinished warning stayed buried under the heavier pain of losing him. Not gone, just buried. 3 months later, I realized I could not keep living like that. It was not some grand breakthrough. It was a small, ugly moment. I was standing in the kitchen one morning, still in my robe, staring at the coffee maker while the kids argued in the background. My reflection in the microwave door looked older than I felt. My father was gone. My mother was gone. My husband left every morning for a business that now legally belonged to me, and I had become this silent person orbiting my own life instead of living it. Something in me rejected that. That same day, I told Murillo I wanted to start going into the office. He looked up at me from his plate, with the kind of expression men wear when they are already preparing to dismiss you. For what? To learn. To be there. It's my father's office, and now it's mine. He chewed slowly, buying time. You don't know anything about accounting? I know that. You can teach me. His face hardened in a way that felt immediate and instinctive, like I had hit a nerve before either of us had time to pretend otherwise. "Denise, you'd only get in the way. You have enough to do here. The kids, the house. This isn't your area." I remember how hot my face got. "My area?" I said. He started talking in that patient, superior tone some men use when they want to insult you while acting reasonable. He said the work was technical. He said it would be stressful. He said the timing was bad. He said I should focus on home because that was where I was needed. The more he talked, the less his words sounded protective, and the more they sounded territorial. He was not trying to spare me. He was trying to keep me out. At the end of that conversation, I almost let him win. He had a way of talking over me until I started doubting my own judgment. But that night, lying in bed beside a man who had turned his back toward me and fallen asleep in minutes, I stared at the dark ceiling and thought about my father in that hospital bed asking whether I trusted him. By morning, I had made up my mind. I told Murillo I was coming in that week. He did not like it. He did not even hide it. But stubbornness is one of the few qualities grief did not take from me. So 2 days later, I drove there anyway. I knew the office closed for lunch from noon to 1. I wanted to arrive after the break, not for any strategic reason at first, just because that fit my morning. When I got there a little after 1, the front door was open and the place was running again. 2 employees were there, both men I vaguely recognized from years of hearing their names, but barely knowing their faces. One was older, quiet, careful with his words. The other was younger, quicker, the kind of person who smiled before he decided how he felt. They seemed surprised to see me. That embarrassed me more than it should have, because the office belonged to me. Yet I entered it like a visitor. I tried to cover that feeling by being warm and casual. I asked how things had been. I looked around. The place still smelled like paper, toner, and coffee, exactly like it had when my father ran it. His old office door was half open down the hall. Even from where I stood, I could see the edge of the same dark wooden desk he had used for years. Murillo was not there yet. I asked one of the employees whether he had stepped out. He said yes. He'd gone to lunch. At 1:45, the front door opened, and my husband walked in laughing with a woman I had never seen before. The laugh died the second he saw me. That was the first thing. He had been smiling with his whole face, loose and animated, the way people look when they are comfortable. The woman beside him was smiling too. She was younger than me, pretty in a polished office way, with long dark hair and the kind of posture that said she knew she looked good without having to work too hard at it. They came through the door mid-conversation with that easy, mutual rhythm people develop when they spend a lot of time alone together. Then they saw me standing there. Murillo's expression changed so fast it almost made a sound. "What are you doing here?" he asked. I looked at the woman, then back at him. "I could ask you the same thing. Lunch ran a little long, didn't it?" The room went tight. The 2 employees stopped pretending not to notice. Not dramatically, not by staring, but in the subtle way people do when they suddenly become very still. Murillo said, "We had to stop by the bank, office business." I pointed at the woman. "You 2 went together?" He said yes, flatly. She gave me an awkward little hello and introduced herself as Adriana. She said she worked there. Her voice sounded careful, but there was something in her eyes I caught even then, some alertness that did not fit simple embarrassment. It was the look of someone recalculating. Murillo quickly guided me toward the back, toward my father's old office. He did it with one hand at my elbow, too lightly for anyone else to call it forceful, too deliberately for me to mistake the intention. He wanted me out of the front area, out of sight, out of earshot. When we got inside, he shut the door. That was the second thing. Not because shutting the door proved anything by itself. It did not. But everything in him that afternoon felt irritated by my presence. Not surprised, not pleased, irritated, like I had walked into a sequence he had not planned to explain. I sat in the chair across from the desk that used to be my father's. Even that hurt. Murillo remained standing for a moment, then asked what exactly I was doing there. I told him I had come to learn, look around, understand how things worked. He started objecting all over again. Timing, logistics, stress, the usual. I barely listened. What stayed with me was the image of him walking in beside Adriana, both of them smiling, then both of them going still. I asked, "Do you two always go to lunch together?" He said, "Sometimes. Not just us. Sometimes other people too." But that was not what I had seen. I had not seen a group returning from lunch. I had seen a man and a woman entering like they had been alone together and only remembered where they were once the door opened. On the drive home that day, my father's questions came back so hard it almost felt physical. "Do you trust him? Do you think he's faithful?" I gripped the steering wheel and tried to be rational. Maybe I was connecting things that did not belong together. Maybe my grief had made me suspicious. Maybe that was all. But suspicion, once it enters a marriage, changes the lighting in every room. Ordinary things start casting weird shadows. After that, I insisted on going to the office regularly. Murillo pushed back every chance he got. He never outright forbade it, because legally he could not. But he did everything short of that. He told me I was slowing things down. He snapped when I asked simple questions. He refused to show me how certain files were organized. If I asked about a client, he gave me the shortest answer possible. If I sat in on anything, he acted tense and distracted, as if my existence in the building was some kind of problem he was being forced to tolerate. It did not take long for me to notice something else. His bad mood was not random. It flared most when I was near him and Adriana. That sharpened me. Since Murillo would not teach me much, I started asking the older employee questions instead. Quiet questions. How many active clients did they have? How billing cycles worked? Who handled payroll? Which accounts were long-term? Who had access to what? I framed it as simple catching up, but really I was trying to understand both the office and the currents inside it. Adriana worked there full-time. She handled client contact, documents, some scheduling, some file management. She had been there longer than I expected. Long enough not to be new. Long enough to have history. She and Murillo moved around each other with a caution that actually made them look more suspicious, not less. Too careful in public. Too neutral. Too quick to create distance when I was nearby. Real innocence does not monitor itself that hard. Still, I had nothing concrete. Just tone, timing, mood, and that old unfinished warning from my father. A week later, something happened that made the suspicion harder to talk myself out of. I had gone out around lunchtime to handle a personal errand. At first I planned to go straight home afterward, so I texted Murillo and told him not to wait for me. He sent back a short okay. But while I was in the car, I changed my mind. I was tired, and I thought I might as well ride home with him instead of taking 2 cars. When I got back to the office, the front area was almost empty. I walked toward the back and saw Murillo's office door closed. That by itself was not shocking. What made my stomach tighten was the silence. Not office silence, contained silence. I opened the door without knocking. Adriana was inside, sitting across from Murillo's desk. They were not touching. They were not doing anything you could point to and call obscene. They were just talking, but the air in that room felt private, interrupted. The second I stepped in, Adriana stood up too fast and started speaking before I had even fully crossed the threshold. "Anyway, I'll send the contract over to the client," she said. Her voice had that rushed, over-explained quality people get when they need a reason for being where they are. Then she left. I stood there looking at my husband. Was I interrupting something important? He knew exactly what I meant. I knew he knew. He did not answer. He gave me that hard look he had started using more and more, as if my suspicion was some offense against him rather than a reaction to his behavior. We drove home together in cold silence. The tension between us got worse after that. Not in dramatic ways at first, in daily ways. Little humiliations, sharp answers in front of the staff, withholding information, treating me like an inconvenience in a place I owned. The office that had once been my father's started feeling like a stage where everybody knew their marks except me. And all the while I kept thinking the same ugly thought. Was I just late to something everyone else had already seen? That question sat in me for days. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a regular workday. Nothing cinematic about it. No storm outside, no shouting, no ominous music. Just fluorescent lights, scattered paperwork, phones ringing in the front, and the smell of reheated food from somebody's lunch. Murillo stepped out of his office to use the restroom. He left his computer on. I wish I could tell you I stumbled onto the truth accidentally. I did not. I went to his computer on purpose. By then I was past the point of wanting reassurance. I wanted either proof or the chance to hate myself for doubting him. Anything was better than that limbo. His email was open. I scanned the inbox first. Nothing unusual. Then I saw the trash folder. 3 emails from Adriana. That was strange immediately. They emailed all day for office reasons. So why were hers in the trash? Why delete work emails unless the content was not really about work? My pulse started hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingers. I opened the first one. You see the way that witch looks at me? Like she wants to swallow me alive. When are you finally getting rid of her? I stopped breathing. For a second I actually thought I had read it wrong. My eyes went over the sentence again. The date. 6 days earlier. It was about me. There was no other possible reading. I opened the second email. Its tone was the same, nasty and familiar. Why is she still hanging around there? It's like she wants to keep watch on us. On us. My whole body went cold and hot at the same time. The third email was the one that ripped the floor open. Ever since that witch started coming here, you never have time for me anymore. I miss our lunches. I miss us together in a motel bed. There are moments when the body reacts before the mind fully catches up. That was one of them. My vision blurred. My ears rang. My hands started shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the desk. The office around me seemed to tilt. I had known, somewhere deep and stubborn, but knowing is one thing. Seeing the words is another. Words take what suspicion leaves vague and make it impossible to escape. Motel bed. Not flirtation. Not maybe. Not emotional closeness. Not harmless lunches. A full affair, disgusting in its confidence. And the language. The nerve of that woman talking about me as if I were the obstacle. As if I were the one in the way inside my own father's office, inside my own marriage, inside my own life. Murillo came back from the restroom and stopped dead in the doorway. I was still sitting in his chair, staring at the screen. He went pale first, then paler. I turned toward him, and when I spoke, my voice came out thin and strange, like it belonged to somebody trying not to explode. What is this? He moved fast to close the door. That was all the answer I needed. He started saying my name in that urgent low voice men use when they are not sorry, only afraid of witnesses. Denise, calm down. Lower your voice. Let me explain. I stood up so fast the chair rolled back and hit the wall. Explain what? I said. Then louder. Explain what, Murillo? That you're sleeping with that trash? He reached for me and I jerked away. He said it was not what I thought, which is such an insulting sentence that I think any woman who has ever heard it in a moment like that should get one free slap by law. The email had said motel bed. What exactly did he think I thought? My voice rose without permission. I demanded he call Adriana in there. Right then. Right that second. By then, the whole office had heard. I could see shapes moving in the hallway. Murillo closed the door fully, probably thinking he could still contain it. But there are things that cannot be contained once they have a name. He kept trying to soften the edges, trying to move me from rage into discussion, and every word out of his mouth made me hate him more. Not because he was confessing, because he still thought management was possible. I shoved past him and opened the door. The office had gone dead quiet. The 2 male employees were frozen at their desks. Adriana was sitting at hers, pale now, eyes wide, but not nearly pale enough for my taste. All the humiliation of the past few months, all the silences, all the contempt in my own husband's face, all my father's unfinished warning, all the grief I had swallowed and redirected into surviving, all of it rushed to the same point at once. I walked straight to her desk. She started to rise. I slapped her so hard she fell sideways out of her chair. I did not plan it. I did not think. My body got there before anything civil could intervene. The sound cracked through the office. Papers fluttered off the corner of her desk. She hit the floor with one hand out, staring up at me in pure shock. I moved toward her again. Murillo grabbed me from behind before I could do more. I was shaking, screaming, calling her every ugly thing I knew. He held my arms while she scrambled up in tears, her face red where my hand had landed. The other employees stood there with that horrible expression people get when a secret has been dragged into daylight before anyone knows where to look. And in that moment, I knew something else. They had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the motel, maybe not how long. But those were not the faces of men discovering an affair. Those were the faces of men watching a truth they had been carrying silently finally explode. That realization hurt almost as much as the emails. Because humiliation deepens when you understand it had an audience. Murillo finally sent everyone home early. Adriana left crying, clutching her purse with one hand pressed against her cheek. The others barely looked at me. I do not know whether that was shame, fear, or just survival. Once the office emptied, Murillo closed the front door and turned back to me like we were about to have some private marital conversation after what he had done. I wanted to break every window in the building. Instead, I stood there in the center of my father's office, chest heaving, and said, "Get your things out of my house today. You're not spending another night there." He tried to speak. I did not let him. That was the first clear decision I had made in months that felt stronger than grief. Not because I was calm. I was not. I was wrecked. But some part of me had finally found the line. He had crossed it. Publicly, shamelessly, repeatedly, in the one place tied to the man who had spent his final strength trying to warn me. I looked around that office and suddenly saw the full obscenity of it. My father had trusted him. My father had brought him in, taught him, elevated him, relied on him. And while standing beside that trust, Murillo had built a hidden life with one of the employees. Lunches, emails, motel rooms, lies. Then when I showed up, he treated me like an inconvenience, like a stupid wife meddling where she did not belong. He had not just betrayed me. He had used my father's world to do it. That was the scene I could not get out of my head later. Not even the slap. It was the image of Murillo sitting at my father's desk as though it were naturally his, deleting emails from his mistress while I moved through grief at home, trusting that he was helping me keep my life together. I told him again to leave. He said we needed to discuss the children, the house, the business. He sounded almost offended by my anger, as if I were refusing him the respectful handling he believed he still deserved. I said, "You don't get to stand there and act like this is complicated." His face changed then. The softness vanished. What came out underneath it was colder, more practical, more recognizable in a terrible way. The man who had been trying to calm me became the man who had always been calculating. He asked what exactly I intended to do. I said I was divorcing him. He stared at me for a moment, then asked about the office. Even then, even there. That was the moment my disgust turned clean, because until then, part of me had still been caught in the emotional side of it. The marriage, the humiliation, the years. But when he pivoted that quickly toward property, toward position, toward what he might still extract, I saw the architecture of him more clearly than I ever had in our whole marriage. He had never only wanted me. He had wanted access, status, security, proximity to something built by someone else. Maybe he had loved me once in whatever limited, selfish way men like that love anyone. But by the end, what mattered most to him was what he stood next to and what he could claim. And that office had become part of that. I fired him that same day. Legally, he had only ever been an employee, even if inside the business he had started to act like an owner. Adriana was fired too. I did it before the day ended because I knew that if I gave myself time to be talked around, somebody would try. Murillo certainly would. Maybe even others. I refused to leave any air in the room for negotiation. One of the older employees, the quiet one, stepped up after that and helped hold things together in the immediate aftermath. I went home alone that evening. That drive was one of the loneliest hours of my life. The adrenaline had started wearing off, and under it was this sick, ripped-open feeling, like my body had survived an impact my mind still had not fully registered. I remember stopping at a red light and suddenly realizing I was gripping the wheel so hard my hands hurt. When I got home, I had to do something I had not prepared for. I had to walk into the same house where my children lived and act like a mother before I had time to collapse as a wife. That is one of the cruelest things about betrayal in a family. Life does not pause long enough for the injured person to bleed in peace. There are still backpacks by the door, still snacks to hand out, still homework folders, still a daughter asking where her favorite shirt is, and a son wanting help with a school login. I kept it together for them that first evening by sheer force. Murillo came later to collect some clothes. I made sure he did it while the kids were in another part of the house. I would not give him the dignity of a scene he could later use to make me look unstable, and I would not let my children see me plead with a man who had already chosen humiliation over loyalty. He tried once, very quietly, to start talking again. I said, "Take your things and go." So he did. And when the door closed behind him, the house sounded wrong. Not peaceful, not relieved, just wrong. Like a piece had been removed, and what remained had not yet decided whether that was damage or repair. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake replaying everything from the beginning, but now the memories came back with new meanings attached to them. Every late lunch, every mood swing, every dismissive answer. Every time he insisted I stay home, every time I entered a room and the tone changed. I thought about Adriana calling me a witch in those emails. I thought about motel beds. I thought about the faces of the other employees. And over all of it hovered my father's voice. "Do you trust him?" No, not anymore. Maybe not for longer than I was willing to admit. The next weeks were brutal. There is no elegant version of being betrayed and then forced immediately into logistics. Lawyers got involved. Murillo wanted things I would have laughed at if I had not been so disgusted. He made demands around the divorce. He wanted leverage. At one point, he even tried to angle for a share connected to the office, which told me either he was delusional or shameless enough not to care how absurd he sounded. I told him to speak through an attorney. That became my line in the sand. Because here is the thing people do not say enough about betrayal. The affair is not always the whole crime. Sometimes the bigger crime is the entitlement after. The cheater who still wants comfort, fairness, dignity, negotiation, accommodation, even reward, after detonating your trust in public. That part can finish off whatever pity survived the first blow. Mine died fast. But none of that made me feel victorious. That is the part people get wrong when they imagine scenes like mine. They picture the exposure, the slap, the firing, the divorce demand, and they assume there must be some fierce, empowering rush underneath it all. There was not. There was anger, yes. There was clarity, too. But underneath both was devastation so deep it made ordinary tasks feel surreal. I had buried my father. Then I had learned he died trying to warn me about my husband. Then I had discovered my husband was sleeping with another woman inside the business my father built. That is not the kind of sequence that leaves a person feeling strong. It leaves her feeling stripped. Still, I stayed standing. And that counted for something. I did not know it yet, but what came after would force me to decide whether I was only the woman this happened to, or the woman who would take her own life back from the ruins of it. For a while, I moved through those weeks like someone carrying broken glass inside her chest. Everything hurt in ways that did not always make sense. The obvious things, yes. His side of the closet, the empty chair at dinner, the silence at night. But also stupid little things that had no business having that much power. A mug he always used, the sound of a garage door in another driveway, a navy tie hanging in the back hall that I had not noticed until after he was gone. Betrayal is ugly like that. It turns objects into traps. I told the kids only what they were old enough to carry. Their father and I were separating. Grown-up reasons. Not their fault. We both loved them. I kept my voice steady while saying it, but I could feel my daughter studying my face in a way children do when they know the words are smaller than the truth. My son asked whether his dad was coming back home. I told him no. He nodded like he understood, then cried later in his room when he thought I could not hear him. That almost broke me more than the affair itself. Because whatever Murillo had done to me, the children still loved him. That is another cruelty people do not talk about enough. When a marriage cracks open because of betrayal, the injured person is expected to carry everybody's pain at once. Her own humiliation, the legal mess, the practical mess, the emotional wreckage, and still the children's confusion too. You still have to be soft for people while feeling like you are made of blades. The office became the next battlefield. I had fired Murillo and Adriana immediately, but firing people and cleaning up what they left behind are not the same thing. In the days that followed, I forced myself to go in every morning. Some part of me hated that building now, but another part of me understood I had no choice. If I stayed away again, I would be abandoning my father's work for the second time, and this time, I knew what abandonment cost. The older employee, Daniel, turned out to be steadier than I had realized. He had worked for my father a long time, and once the immediate shock wore off, he became the one person in that office who spoke to me with the kind of careful honesty I needed. Not pity, not drama, just honesty. He helped me understand which client files mattered most, what deadlines were close, what had been handled well, what had not. I spent hours in my father's old office with stacks of folders spread across the desk, learning more in a week than I had learned in all the years I spent pretending that part of life belonged to the men around me. The first few days were unbearable in another way too. Shame has a smell. It sits in rooms where everybody knows something happened, and nobody knows what language to use around it. The younger employee avoided my eyes. The receptionist who came in part-time became overly polite, which was worse. Even Daniel, as kind as he was, moved with the caution of a man trying not to make a bruise worse. I understood why. They had all heard me. Some of them had seen Adriana on the floor. They had seen my marriage explode in my father's office between tax files and client binders and half-drunk coffee. There was no dignified version of returning after that. But I returned anyway. That mattered. One morning, maybe 10 days after everything blew up, I was going through archived records in the storage room when I found something that made me sit down on a box because my legs suddenly felt weak. It was my father's handwriting. Not unusual in itself. His handwriting was everywhere in that office. Labels, notes, initials, corrections in red ink. But this was on a yellow legal pad tucked between two old client folders in a cabinet near the back. The top page had routine numbers on it, Then halfway down there were a few lines that had clearly not been written as office work. Murillo, careless lately. Adriana too, comfortable. Need to talk to Denise. The words were simple. That made them worse. I stared at that page for a long time. No dramatic paragraph. No explanation. No dates attached to a full confession. Just the kind of blunt notation my father made when he wanted to remember something important without ornament. He had seen it. Maybe not everything. Maybe not motel emails. But enough. Enough to note it. Enough to plan to speak to me. Enough to carry that concern into a hospital room when he was dying. I took the pad into his office and shut the door behind me. For the first time since his funeral, I cried there. Not the wild public kind of crying I did at the hospital. This was quieter, uglier, more private. I cried because he had tried. He had really tried. He had seen danger near me and still thought like a father, even while his own body was shutting down. He had wanted to protect me one last time. And I cried because he died before he could finish. That page became the object I kept in my drawer after that. Not because it changed anything legally. It did not. But it changed something inside me. It ended the last pocket of self-doubt. I was not crazy. I had not invented warning signs out of grief. My father had seen enough to be alarmed. That mattered. It mattered more than I can explain. A week after I found that note, Murillo asked through his attorney for a meeting about property and custody scheduling. I did not want to see him. The sight of his name on a document was enough to spike my pulse. But my attorney said some things would move faster if we sat down once with everyone present and got through the basic issues. So I agreed. The meeting was in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and stale coffee. Neutral walls, neutral table, neutral legal language. Places like that are designed to flatten emotion, as if betrayal and greed can be reduced to numbered points on paper. Murillo came in wearing a gray suit and the same expression he used to wear when meeting clients, serious and controlled, as if he were the stable one in the room. That disgusted me immediately. He had always known how to dress himself into credibility. He greeted my attorney before he looked at me. Then he looked at me with this restrained sadness that was clearly meant to read as regret. It almost worked from a distance. If you did not know him, if you had not seen the deleted emails, if you had not watched him panic with my father's desk behind him, you might have bought it. I did not. We went through the ordinary topics first. The house, the kids' schedule, school costs, accounts. Then, exactly as I expected, he tried again to make himself sound more essential to the business than he was. He talked about years invested, client relationships, operational continuity, how much he had contributed. He did it in this measured, professional tone, as if the affair and the deception, and the fact that the office had come to me through my dead father, were all regrettable side notes around the real issue, which in his mind was his financial positioning. I sat there listening to him and felt something in me cool, permanently. Because all through our marriage I had mistaken his confidence for solidity. In that room I saw it for what it was, appetite dressed as competence. When he finished one of those carefully worded statements about the business, I said, "You used my father's office to carry on an affair with an employee while I was grieving him. Let's not pretend we're here discussing some noble contribution." The room went still. His attorney looked down. Mine kept her face neutral. Murillo's jaw tightened. For a second the mask slipped, and I saw the old anger underneath, the irritation he always felt when I stopped behaving like the manageable version of me he preferred. He said very calmly that personal issues should remain separate from the business discussion. That sentence told me everything about the kind of man he really was. Personal issues. As if sleeping with a subordinate in the office my father built, then trying to edge me out of it after my father's death, were just marital turbulence. As if betrayal only counts as personal when it hurts the person doing it. I looked him in the eyes and said, "No, You made it business the second you brought her into that building and tried to make me feel like I didn't belong there." He did not have an answer to that, not a real one. The meeting ended without giving him what he wanted. He did not get a share of the office. He did not get to talk me soft. He did not get to walk out feeling like he had controlled the room. That should have felt satisfying. It did a little. But mostly it left me drained in the way all contact with him left me drained now, like I had spent 2 hours breathing air with something rotten in it. A few days later, I learned something else. Not from spying this time. Not from legal papers either. From Daniel. He knocked lightly on my office door one evening after the others had gone home. He was holding a folder, but he did not sit right away. He looked like a man deciding whether to cross a line. I asked what it was. He said, "There's something I think you should know. I wasn't sure if it was my place before." My stomach tightened immediately. He sat down and chose his words with painful care. He said that over the last year, more than one client had quietly started contacting him instead of Murillo about certain things. Delays, confusion, numbers that had to be corrected, meetings Murillo supposedly handled that did not line up the way they should have. Nothing dramatic enough on its own to create a scandal, but enough to make Daniel uneasy. I felt my spine straighten. He told me he had brought some of it to my father's attention before my father got very sick. Not with accusations, exactly. More like concerns. My father had started looking more closely at a few accounts. Then his health worsened fast, and after that, everything got swallowed by the hospital, the funeral, and the transition. "What kind of concerns?" I asked. Daniel slid the folder toward me. Inside were copies. Emails, corrected spreadsheets, notes about missing signatures on internal approval forms, and a few expense entries that looked, even to my untrained eye, too loose for a man who always acted superior about precision. Not major embezzlement. Nothing cinematic. But small manipulations, sloppy reimbursements, charges that blurred personal and business use, a habit of treating boundaries like suggestions. My face went hot as I turned the pages. Of course the affair had not been the only thing. Men like Murillo rarely keep one corruption neatly boxed away from the others. Once they start believing they are entitled to more than what is theirs, that entitlement spreads. It shows up in money, space, access, loyalty, credit. Everything. Daniel said quietly, "Your father was checking into it." I looked up. "He never got to finish," Daniel said. "But I think that's part of what changed how he was seeing Murillo near the end." There it was. Another layer, another missing piece settling into place. My father had not just sensed a moral problem. He had seen pattern, carelessness, arrogance, possession where there should have been respect. He had been watching Murillo become a man who thought proximity gave him ownership. I thanked Daniel for telling me. After he left, I locked the door and sat in the growing dark with the folder in front of me. I thought about all the times Murillo came home acting stressed, talking about burdens, about responsibility, about how much he was carrying for my father, for the office, for the family. I had believed that version of him because it was flattering to believe your husband is tired from being useful, rather than tired from maintaining lies. That night, I copied everything and sent it to my attorney. Not because I needed revenge, because I was done being late to the truth. After that, my work inside the office changed. It stopped being just survival and became reclamation. I learned fast, faster than Murillo ever wanted me to believe I could. I sat with Daniel in the mornings and asked question after question until the language of the place stopped sounding foreign. I met with clients. I listened more than I talked. I fixed small organizational messes first, then bigger ones. I had software access changed, passwords updated, signature authority tightened, personal expense reporting cleaned up. I checked every reimbursement Murillo had touched in the last year. It was humiliating in one sense, discovering how much had been happening around me while I stayed home believing the story I had been handed. But there was another truth inside it too. I was not stupid. I had been excluded. That is different, and once I understood that, shame started losing some of its grip. The children adjusted slowly, unevenly. Some days were fine, some days were landmines. Their father took them on scheduled weekends and brought them back with gifts that annoyed me more than they should have, not because the gifts were wrong, but because they were so transparent. A new game, a shopping trip, extra dessert. Men who fail in loyalty often reach for performance next. It is easier than accountability. Easier than answering why a family split apart. My daughter got sharper with him sooner than my son did. She was old enough to notice tone, absence, guilt, disguised as generosity. She never asked me outright what he had done, but once, while helping me dry dishes, she said, "Dad acts weird now, like he wants us to think he's nice all the time." I looked at her and said carefully, "People sometimes do that when they know they've hurt someone." She nodded without looking up. That was all. Around the same time, the social side of the fallout reached me too. Because affairs do not stay contained inside the people committing them. They spread through circles, whispers, church parking lots, school pickup lines, family phone calls, old friends choosing sides while pretending not to. Some people were kind, some were cautious. Some were hungry in that quiet way people get when they know something ugly happened and want enough details to feel entertained without having to admit that is what they are doing. Marilo's sister called me one evening and tried the soft version first. She said she was sorry things had gotten so complicated. That word again. Complicated. Then little by little she shifted into the real mission, which was to suggest that men make mistakes. Marriages go through seasons. Public scenes make healing harder. And maybe it would be better for everyone if I tried to keep things calm. I listened until she was done. Then I said, "He cheated on me with an employee in my father's office while my father was dying." There is no calm version of that. She was silent for 2 beats, probably because it sounded uglier out loud than it did in whatever softened family language they had been using around it. Then she said she had not realized it was like that. I said, "That was the problem. A lot of people didn't realize what it was like because he got very good at deciding how things looked." After that, there were fewer calls. Good. The first time I saw Adriana again after the office incident was 3 months later in a grocery store parking lot. I had the kids with me. That matters because if I had been alone, I honestly do not know how that moment would have gone. But I was not alone, and they were close enough to hear if voices rose. So the whole thing happened under a kind of forced restraint. She was loading bags into a silver sedan 2 rows over when our eyes met. For a second, neither of us moved. She looked thinner. Not tragic, not ruined. Just smaller somehow. Less polished. Her confidence had gone brittle. Maybe losing the job did that. Maybe being dragged into daylight as somebody's hidden woman does that. Maybe she had simply discovered that sneaking around with a married man feels more glamorous before the consequences become public and practical. My daughter was asking me something about cereal. I answered without taking my eyes off Adriana. Then Adriana did something that shocked me. She started walking toward me. Not all the way, not dramatically, but enough to make her intention clear. She stopped a few feet away, hands tight at her sides, and said my name. I told the kids to put the bags in the back seat. Then I looked at her. She said, "I know you probably don't want to hear anything from me." That was true. She swallowed. "But I am sorry." The parking lot seemed to go very still. I believed she was nervous. I did not believe she understood the depth of what she was apologizing for. Women like Adriana often think the wife hates them mainly for the sex, for the secrecy, for the insult. They do not always understand that what they join is something larger. A whole machinery of humiliation, deletion, gaslighting, contempt. The wife becomes an obstacle inside her own life while everyone involved quietly rearranges around her. I said, "Sorry for what?" She looked shaken by the directness of that. "For all of it," she said. "I know I shouldn't have..." No, I said. Be specific. Her mouth tightened. For the affair. I nodded once. And for speaking about me like I was disposable? For helping him make me feel like I was in the way in my own father's office? For sitting in that place and treating my grief like cover? Her eyes filled then. Good. Let them, she said, barely above a whisper. He told me things weren't what they look like between you two. I laughed. I could not help it. It came out cold and short. Of course he did. She flinched. Because there it was, the oldest script in the world, the miserable marriage, the distant wife, the emotional loneliness, the technical separation that only exists in one person's mouth. Men like Murillo always recruit their mistresses with some version of moral fog. Enough to let them feel chosen instead of dirty. I stepped closer, just enough that she had to really hear me. He lied to me for years, I said. You thought he was telling you the truth? She looked down. I could have torn into her more. Part of me wanted to. But my son called from the cart asking if we were leaving, and in that instant I felt the line I would not cross. I was not going to stand in a parking lot with my children 5 feet away and give this woman another scene to carry around as evidence that she had once mattered enough to destroy my peace twice. So I said the one thing that felt truest. You weren't special. You were useful. That landed. I saw it hit her face before she turned away. Then I got in the car and drove home with my hands shaking on the wheel. Not because I regretted what I said, because I knew it was true. And because knowing what kind of man he really was did not erase the fact that I had spent almost 13 years married to him. The divorce moved forward. The folder Daniel gave me helped more than I expected. Not in some dramatic courtroom way, but in the quiet, strategic way facts help when a man is trying to inflate his value. Once it became clear Murillo had been loose with business boundaries, and that I was actively correcting those problems, the fantasy he had built of himself as indispensable became harder to sustain. He settled sooner than he would have liked. Not generously, not nobly, just sooner. When the papers were finally signed, I expected some cinematic feeling. Relief, collapse, victory, something. What I actually felt was closer to exhaustion with a pulse under it, like I had dragged something heavy over a finish line, and only afterward realized I no longer had to keep pulling. I went back to the office after signing. I sat alone in my father's chair and stared at the wall for a long time. The room had been repainted by then. New files had been organized. Adriana's desk was gone. Murillo's access was long revoked. The place felt cleaner in every sense, yet ghosts still lived in it. My father's voice, my own scream, the sound of that slap, the shift in the room when truth arrived before anyone was ready. I opened the drawer and looked at the yellow note again. Murillo, careless lately. Adriana too comfortable. Need to talk to Denise. I touched the page with 2 fingers. Then I said out loud to an empty room, I know, Dad. I know. That was when I felt something I had not felt since before the hospital. Not happiness, not peace either. Alignment. Like grief and truth had finally stopped pulling in opposite directions for 1 second. Running the business changed me in ways I had not expected. At first I did it because I had to, because there was nobody else I trusted enough, and because surrendering it would have felt like losing my father twice. But over time it became more than defense. It became proof. Proof that the version of me Murillo preferred, the sheltered wife whose ignorance made his control easier, had never been the whole of me. Clients responded well to honesty. Better than I feared. A few left after the chaos. Most stayed. Some even became warmer once they realized I was paying attention personally. Daniel turned into a real ally. We hired carefully. We tightened everything. By the end of the year, the office was steadier than it had been in a long time. One afternoon, Almost 11 months after the affair exploded, a client I had only met twice before said something casual while gathering her bag after a meeting. "Your father would have been proud of how you turned this place around." She said it kindly and walked out before I could answer. I shut the door and sat down because that simple sentence hit somewhere deep. For so long I had measured that whole period of my life by what was taken from me. My mother, then my father, then my marriage, then my trust, then the illusion of safety inside my own home. But sitting there after that woman left, I understood something else. Not everything had been taken. Some things had been forced into view. My father's faith in me had existed long before I was capable of seeing it. Why else would he have wanted to talk to me? Not just about the affair, but about the office, about what he was noticing, about the man I had let too close. Somewhere inside him, he still believed I was the person who should know, the person who should understand, the person who should eventually stand there. And eventually, I did. The children got older. The pain changed shape. It never vanished, not completely. Certain anniversaries still came in hard. My father's birthday, the date of his death, the week everything fell apart. Some songs still reminded me of the wrong years. Some quiet evenings still made the house feel wider than it should. There were moments, even much later, when grief and betrayal touched the same nerve, and I had to sit very still until the feeling passed. But it did pass. That was the miracle I did not believe in at first. Not that pain disappears. It does not. That it stops being the center of every room. The last time Murilo and I had a serious face-to-face conversation was outside our son's middle school during a spring event. Not about us, not really. About schedules and forms and ordinary co-parenting things. The ordinariness of it almost unsettled me more than conflict would have. He looked older, softer in some places, harder in others. Like life had not punished him theatrically, but it had worn down the confidence he once mistook for immunity. At one point he said, in a low voice, "I know you'll never forgive me." I looked at him. Then I said, "This was never about forgiveness. It was about seeing you clearly." He did not answer. He just nodded once. That was enough. Because forgiveness, in the way people often use the word, can become another performance. Another thing women are asked to do to prove they are healed, evolved, generous, spiritually mature. I was not interested in any of that. I did not need to absolve him to move on. I only needed the truth to stay true. And it did. The marriage I lost was not the marriage I thought I had. That realization hurt, but it also set me free. Years have a way of sanding the sharpest edges off even the ugliest memories, but not all of them. There are still details I remember too clearly. The hospital rail under my hand, the exact color that drained out of Murilo's face when he saw me at his computer. Adriana's email calling me a witch. The office going silent. My father's handwriting on yellow paper. Some memories do not fade, because they are made of revelation, and revelation burns differently than ordinary pain. Sometimes people ask when I first knew. They mean when I first knew he was cheating. I usually tell them the truth. I suspected before I knew. I knew before I had proof. And maybe, somewhere deeper than both, some part of me had been feeling the shape of that betrayal long before I had words for it. The contempt. The exclusion. The subtle rewiring of my own life around his convenience. Affairs rarely begin the day they are discovered. They begin in smaller permissions. A lie here, a deleted message there, a lunch that becomes a habit, a private joke, a wife dismissed, a boundary moved and moved again until the people crossing it no longer even feel the line beneath their feet. That was the real horror of it. Not just that he betrayed me, that he built a version of our life where my displacement was part of his comfort. And still, that is not the final truth I carry. the final truth is this. He thought grief would make me weaker. It made me see. My father died before he could finish warning me, but he left me enough. A question, a look, a note in his own hand. And in the wreckage that followed, those fragments did what a full speech might not have done. They forced me to stop living at a distance from my own life. I lost my mother. Then I lost my father. Then I lost the marriage I thought I had. For a long time, I believed those losses meant life was only taking from me. I was wrong. Some losses are not just endings. Some losses expose the theft. And once you see that clearly, you stop begging for what was never really yours. You stop mourning the mask like it was a face. And you walk forward with the one thing betrayal can never give back once it is gone: your illusion. What would you do in this situation? Be honest. Or did this remind you of someone? Tell me in the comments. And if this made you think about your own relationship, I left something in the description that can help you build something stronger. Subscribe if you want more stories like this every day, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story.